I'm really happy to see so many interested people at this conference. When it was proposed to discuss the issue in the European Parliament, I was not sure that such a technical issue as the big data in public procurement and in the fight against corruption will attract so many people. So it's really a good surprise for me. I would invite you to find a place. Perhaps you can move also here inside. You can see the presentations much better from here than from there. I know it's not the most polite thing to invite you to sit on the floor here, but for some of you, perhaps the younger ones, it's still possible to be there. So. Thank you very much for coming today to the European Parliament, and I also would like to say thank you for the DIGIWHIST network project, and personally to Mihaly Fazekas, who originally proposed to me to organize a meeting on this project and the outcomes of the project in the European Parliament. So thank you for all of those who participated in the project and who contributed to organize this meeting, including my staff, who made a great job in organizing this event today. On behalf of the European Parliament and the Green Group in the European Parliament also, I would like to warmly welcome you, and I hope that our discussion today will contribute to the ongoing discussions in the European Parliament from the discharge procedure till the post-2020 MFF debate, which is ongoing, and what can be done in the European institutions to improve our fight against corruption and to improve the use of public funds. As public spending was always in the center of temptation for political favoritism and corruption, so it's really an important issue. It is a quite pressing problem in the EU and also in the member states. It undermines not only public financing, but I truly believe that it undermines as well the trust in the democratic institutions and the democratic values. So when we are talking about the crisis in the European project, we have to talk about corruption and how the trust could be given back in the EU institutions by the people. For example, according to the figures of the European Commission, the costs of corruption cost about 120 billion euros a year, but alternative studies say that it's much higher and can reach even at the level of 900 billion euros yearly. Even with the lowest number, the 120 billion euros a year, it's higher than the complete budget of the European Union. So what we are losing with corruption is not peanuts, it's not just a price we have to pay, but it's comparable for all the money we spend on what we call the European Union. The VAT gap in the EU amounts to about 150 billion euro annually, again, which is higher than the whole budget of the EU on a yearly basis. So there is a lot of things to do here. In democratic countries where transparency and accountability is a cornerstone, there is a continuous effort to annihilate such practices and to improve the efficiency of public spending. One of those steps was to introduce the public procurement, started not yesterday, but public procurement itself does not prevent the possibility of misusing funds without appropriate controlling mechanisms and monitoring. There is even a bigger temptation if the governments and their authorities spend European funds. European money is not directly linked to the national budgets and seems less important to properly tender it or account it. Even in countries where there is a relatively long-lasting culture of transparency for national spendings, there is a bigger chance of being, let's say, more generous with European funds than national funds. In my home country, Hungary, there are clear studies suggesting that when it comes to European funds, almost everything is possible, and there are no limits for the misuse of EU funds. However, there are a few dedicated people and organizations which are dedicated to the protection of the EU's financial interest and fighting for more transparency and accountability in the EU. Ex officio, this is the job of the European Commission, first of all, of course, but also the Budgetary Control Committee of the European Parliament, the Court of Auditors, OLAF, the Anti-Fraud Office of the European Union, and, of course, the civil society, NGOs, investigative journalists, dedicated European citizens, and academics, researchers as well. The DIGIWHIST project brought together quite a few such dedicated experts from different fields and institutes from all Europe with the support of the European Horizon 2020 frame. DIGIWHIST's goal is from the very beginning to improve the efficiency of public spending across Europe by systemic collection, structuring, and analysis. The project, as you might know, or those who participate in DIGIWHIST, of course, you know very well, this project compiles and evaluates micro-level data using information from individual public procurement transactions and winning firms' finance and ownership structures, which is quite a number of data. And here we come to the problem of big data. How can we manage this enormous amount of information in a way to really contribute to the better management of European funds? Their aim is to identify systemic vulnerabilities in the respective legislation and their implementation, and indirectly to help the governments and the Commission to improve the legislation and to monitoring mechanisms, just to improve the trust of the citizens in the democratic institutions across Europe. That's, I think, the final goal with this project as well. This conference today intends to introduce all the findings and the recommendations of the DIGIWHIST project, which must be used vastly by the European institutions and the member states as well. Although this is the closing conference of the project, or at least an end of a financing period, but I trust that, and here I look at all the people from the Commission, that this knowledge will be kept and properly used, not like the anti-corruption report of the EU, which is a sad story, I must say. And this group of people will remain together after the DIGIWHIST project itself, and we'll work together, and I hope that we will be able to find sources for the future of such projects, to continue to develop and to improve the information we received from the DIGIWHIST project, and to continue to use them in everyday policy making. With those initial thoughts, I would like to wish ourselves a very successful conference for today and very successful fight against corruption in the forthcoming years, which is highly needed in the EU. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. I'm Ella McPherson. I am a PI on this project and a lecturer in sociology at the University of Cambridge. On behalf of the DIGIWHIST team, I want to extend a very warm welcome to all of you to this final conference called, of course, Big Data with Local Impact, Using Open Data to Improve Public Procurement. So in looking at the world of public procurement open data in Europe, the project so far has revealed a surprising diversity of data quality and reporting standards, surpassing even our wildest expectations. Nevertheless, the team managed to collect an unprecedented amount of data, over 17 million contracts, mostly from between 2009 to 2017. Our data captures about between 3 and 9% of GDP. The question remains, though, where's the rest of the money? Macro estimates of procurement spending put the likely value more in the domain of 12 to 13% of annual GDPs. So the gap between the contracts we've been able to find so far and all the contracts out there is significant. Much work remains to be done to achieve a full level of transparency around public procurement. So yes, this is the final conference in terms of the Horizon 2020 DIGIWHIST project. It's due to complete in about a month. But the core team is continuing and has set up the framework for keeping up with this work and going ahead to pursue this continuing transparency and towards building trust. The project continues with generous seed funding from the Open Society Initiative for Europe and Mihaly Fazekas. Did I say that right? Yeah. There we go. Thanks. Who will be leading that continuation of the project. So in general, we are very keen to establish partnerships to continue this work that we've started. We want to pursue policy reform, pushing for better data, and improving the large-scale open data infrastructure setup. And next, I turn to Mihaly, who's my colleague from Cambridge, and who runs a project, and I believe you're going to say things.
Yes, thank you very much, Benedek, for your kind introductory words, and also for you, Ella. Really just a few housekeeping words about the conference. I'm also sorry for those of you who have to stand, but we will, swap those chairs which are there to alleviate your pain. I'm really sorry for this. Well, anyways, we have three main sessions and a closing panel. And the logic is fairly straightforward. We start from data and data quality, what we have, the facts of administration. Then we move on to indicators and insights to make sense of all this. And then the third session will talk about tools which we can give to civil society, citizens, journalists, and public administrations. And finally, the concluding panel will look at what the EU can do, what the European Commission can do with all these data, indicators, and tools, and the resources it has at its hand. Each of the sessions is set up in a particular way so that we can link to ongoing debates, link to what's being done by you sitting around this table. So we start off with a brief introduction to what DIGIWHIST has achieved. Then we invite 2 or 3 commentaries from notable experts of this field. And finally, we open the floor and hope to have a good 20-25 minutes for your own questions. So I think we are on time, surprisingly, at the very first session. I hand over the, let's keep it like that. Let's hand over the word to Jiri Skuhrovec, and I'm going to take care of the PowerPoint.
Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jiri Skuhrovec, and I'm in charge of, say, quality control of the data throughout the DIGIWHIST project. And our team is also taking over the data collection agenda now for the sustainability time. My presentation will be about the cornerstone of what's the most important fundamental for, or the fundamental for the further outputs and nice things that we have been so far able to produce, and that's the procurement data, the most cumbersome output of which, that we have produced within DIGIWHIST. So I'll start with the most ugly, but maybe the most important slide, summarizing the volume of the data which we gathered, which is really something above 17 million of tenders. To give you introduction into the ugly table, one row, let's say the one before the last one, says that in Netherlands there is a portal called tendernet.nl, where some national procurements are published. We wrote a software for extracting data from the portal. We found out there are 29 different data templates or structures from which we need to extract the data. So we wrote a tailored software for each of such form or web page, how do you call it? And we found 56,000 tenders ranging from 2010 to 2017. So that's one tiny piece of a job. Each row means one national source or TED from which we gather data. Totally, it's 21 sources and 17 millions of tenders. As you can see, the distribution or the sources are ordered by amount of tenders we've got from each individual country. And as you can see, the numbers aren't that straightforward as you would expect. You would expect to be getting larger volume and larger amount of tenders from bigger countries, however, which holds for, say, Poland and France. However, you can find some surprises that in Georgia, for instance, you can find 3 times more data on 3 times more tenders than in the UK. Yeah, or that my country, Czech Republic, also scores above many quite larger economies in EU. So you start asking, why is it that some countries publish considerably more information on the tenders than others? However, this pile of data, those 17 millions, sounds really great, and well, we see many countries listed and say, oh, that's nice that we got 195,000 of tenders from Romania. But let's look more into the quality of the data, because sometimes it's just a couple of variables, sometimes it's much more. When talking about quality, that's a multi-dimensional thing. You can talk about scope of the data, what's actually, which authorities publish the data, what's the time scope. You can talk about the depth and detail, the number of variables you can get per tender. You can talk about quality, the reliability of what you are really getting, if the prices are really prices or just random numbers, or you can talk about availability, if the data is available on day-to-day basis. But we don't have a room for that, so if you can move on, Michi. For purpose of this presentation, I introduced really simplified data quality scale to give you some idea on what's the data quality from various sources. So obviously, scale starts with having no data at all. And we are moving to, okay, we can have fragments of data. That means we have some procurements and some information of them. We are quite certain that doesn't give us the full picture, but at least we have something. Then we are slowly getting to state of a couple of countries where we do have something close to the full picture, like we have all the tenders that happened in the country, but there are quite some missing fields or errors in the data. And the ideal, which neither of the countries reach, is to have data which is actually reliable and broad and covering all the contracts. So that's the dream of us, the data guys, but that's nothing you really get out there. Maybe let's move on to the next slide. Outlining, so if you have certain quality of data, you can do certain things with it. Unless you have the quality, you don't. So if the ideal data I was talking about just a while ago, that would enable us to do quality audit, quality cross-country comparison, it would allow private companies to build swift e-service which don't work only in one country. Yeah, so that's the ideal which we would want to, but I would say that's a dream in all of the EU countries. If you move a little bit lower with your expectations and accept some errors, holes, etc., you can still produce quite decent policy analysis, market monitors, while you need to be aware of type or flaws that you have in the data in a given country. If you go even below, where you realize, okay, I by far don't have all of the tenders, but at least I got something, still you can produce watchdog portals, try to look for various red flags. Of course, you can take the data and point out what's missing. Say, okay, compared to different countries, that's what we do at DIGIWHIST, this country doesn't publish almost anything at all. Or you can do research. I'm not saying that this data is good enough for any research. Of course, the better data, the better the research. But if you need to do simple statistics, this is the baseline you can start with to produce at least something for some countries. And of course, if you get to the state of having no data, which I probably won't surprise you that that's the state where most policymakers are right now. So only thing you can do is to push for change and push for actually getting some reasonable data for evidence-based policy, because without it you can just pass random laws and hope for the best. Move on. So these are the results we get while comparing the countries on the scale I've just introduced. There's additional axis depicting what's the age of the data, if we have data from 2005 or onwards, or if we have just data from 2010. So as you can see, there's a couple of countries like Latvia, Slovakia, Estonia in the space where data is actually usable for most of the things besides strict audit. And as we move on to the left, we can, no, not yet, please. We see a couple of other countries which publish data in some shape. Some of them are better, some of them are worse. But I would like to draw your attention from, well, it seems that Ireland is one of the worst performing countries in terms of data quality. However, it's important to realize that there are many other countries, those are those in left bottom corner, where we found that their national portal is either non-existent or sufficient data of sufficient quality is impossible to get from. So countries like Germany are, even from our perspective, even worse than Ireland, because Ireland at least has a national portal where it tries to publish some procurement data, whereas Germany does not. In Italy, that's a different story. Italy has some national portal, but essentially to get the data out of it, we would need to hack it, which we decided not to do within European project. So Italy is also listed among the countries which aren't really publishing data in sufficient quality because the public, such as us, can't really get their hands on it. So please move on to the next slide. Here I depicted, what I need to stress is that even though we've been working on the data over 2 years, extraction data from text websites, etc., is quite cumbersome and produces various results. So even though we are quite confident we produced quite good data sets in terms of what were the limits in DIGIWHIST, there are still some countries where we feel that if we focused more time, if we devoted more time to processing all the data more perfectly, we could get some improvement. So this slide just outlines a couple of countries where we feel that we can get a little bit better. So for instance, again, I yellowed out Italy, where we feel that we can get to the data actually if we had more resources and legal backup. So this just outlines, okay, so this is the possibility for improvement of the DIGIWHIST data. Whereas still I need to stress that the position on a graph is mostly not given by quality of our software and of our data collection, but it's given by the quality of data in given country in the first place. So the countries to the left should, in the first place, try to push the quality of their data higher if they want someone to work with it, if they want policy analysis, if they want audit. They should definitely struggle to get better data because currently they are not in the status to receive that. Let's move on, please. To give you some glimpse of what's under this simplified scope of data quality I just introduced. For instance, it's organizational IDs. Sounds boring, but IDs of suppliers and buyers in procurement are quite essential when you want to ask questions like who get the most money? Who is selling the most, yeah? To identify reliably who got money from whom, that's a crucial part of our job. And frankly, sometimes we don't have sufficient inputs to do it very well. If you take a look, France is publishing organizational IDs with about 20% of the tenders. UK doesn't publish organizational IDs at all. So consequently, when you look at DIGIWHIST output, sometimes we are not really sure whether 3 tenders, there are 3 different companies or it's one company. So obviously, the more IDs published, the better quality of the data and better outputs you can do with them. Let's move on. Another statistics on data quality is actual coverage of the full tender cycle. Of course, in most of the countries, you get contract notices introducing the contract and contract awards saying who got the contract. However, it's less so with availability of information like, yeah, this tender has been cancelled, or in the end, this tender was a success and we just paid a little bit more money for it. So information like that you get, again, even just in a smaller number of countries. Now it seems that I don't like UK, so in Sweden you only get the notices and awards, and that's pretty much it. Let's move on to the last slide. So far, I've been omitting countries like Germany because, yeah, like I said, those are the countries where we didn't get any data because they don't have national portals. However, we wanted to provide some benchmark, some comparison of all the countries, saying, okay, so what's the published data quality? And for that, we use Tender Electronic Daily, for which all the countries are mandated. So we practically chose 12 fields which are mandatory to publish. So we expect that they will be fully available in 100% of the tenders, and did the statistics whether they really are available in TED 2016. So we compared all the countries according to that and found out that, sure, there are quite some differences in terms of availability of the data. So somewhere you got 15% of the data missing, and that's actually the best case of Croatia. Yeah, they have lowest data missing rate. Whereas on the other hand, there are countries like Portugal, Iceland, or Malta, where 35% of the variables are missing. I'm stressing these are variables which are mandatory published, like final price. Yeah, and we don't have that for those countries. So this is a comparison just glimpsing that even in above threshold tenders, those which are expected to be super good, we have quite a lot of missing data, and you can picture that under the threshold, it can be even more complicated. So that's it from me. If you want to get more details, numbers on the validation on the data quality for given countries, please follow the link. I'm just stressing that this is still work in progress, and we will keep on updating the data quality report. So in a month from now, you can get the final ones. Data is available already at opentender.eu, and there's my contact, and that's everything from me. And I'll pass on word to Gavin Hayman, who is CEO at Open Contracting Partnership, trying to promote the publishing of open data on public procurement towards government.
Thank you so much, Jiri. Bonjour, guten Tag, hello. I'm Gavin Hayman, as you said. The Open Contracting Partnership is a silo-busting collaboration trying to work across government, civil society, and business and technologists to open up the entire chain of public contracting information. So from the planning through the awards and through the tender, the award, and then the actual completion, execution of contracts. And we're trying to do that for the trillions of dollars that are spent on public procurement sort of across the world. And we do that through a combination of both trying to encourage radically improved disclosure, improved transparency, open data, and we manage an open contracting data standard to unlock and share that information from different government silos and departments. And also, very importantly, business and citizen engagement, so that data actually gets used and integrated into policy to create change. So I guess first up, I would say I think this is an awesome project, the DIGIWHIST project, right? They've done all the hard work of trying to collect and scrape European procurement data from multiple different portals and put it together and make it user-friendly and accessible for the first time. That's an amazing amount of hard work. I kind of think they deserve a clap. Could we give them a quick round of applause? Thank you. But also, the hard work's been done, and now comes the exciting part to use that data to create change. And it comes at just the right time, because the new EU regulations on public procurement are coming in, and the DIGIWHIST data can really inform and drive better implementation. So many of you know about the new EU rules. They're dealing with conflict of interest. They're mandating contract registrars. They're encouraging e-procurement, or mandating it from 2018. So it's at a really kind of opportune moment. And it's just worth pausing for a second to think about why this is so important as well. We're talking about 2 trillion euros worth of spending every year. As you said, it's about 12 to 14% of EU GDP. And we can only see about 6 to 9% of it, I think you're saying. So there's obviously a huge gap there. And the one thing perhaps I'm most surprised about, my past life was as a corruption hunter working for a very cool NGO that used to kind of investigate corruption. And I used to deal with sort of dirty deals coming from Africa and elsewhere, but I'm just surprised, having moved into the world of public procurement, something I thought was solved, actually how fragmented and patchy the data is. And I think the DIGIWHIST program really shows that. If you think that you have your mandatory TED fields and a quarter of them are missing in most cases, you know, I'm really surprised by that kind of level of problem. It's also worth saying that there's a challenge in the EU with declining competition, even for the TED tenders themselves. So I think in 2006, something like 17% of tenders only had a single bid. Now, I think as of 2015, it's up to about 30%. So there's a genuine sort of challenge there. It's also worth saying, kind of beyond corruption, there's also just the issue of competition and market opportunity. It's central to building a single common market, to have that kind of fair and level playing field across different countries. And so we need to be able to monitor and measure that. And I think DIGIWHIST is showing us where those gaps are. The Commission is rightly proud of the work it's done so far. Now I think it's the opportunity to really drive better implementation across the board. I think there's some also pretty simple ways that can be done. Number one is, how do we get to better and open data? And I think the DIGIWHIST folks have already shown this, with a small team with not that much funding can collect together all the existing information and do a better job than perhaps many national authorities of rendering that information available. What could we do if we had a properly informed programme of implementation across different Europe and the member states? Let me give you a simple example. So I'm from the UK. The UK's second biggest public construction company, Carillion, has just imploded. You know, a financial disaster, badly mismanaged. There's a desperate scramble across the UK government looking for a number of contracts. If you go to the UK's biggest contract register, something called Contracts Finder, you can find 10 contracts listed there that belong to Carillion. The DIGIWHIST folks have collected all the different portals and sub-portals in the UK, and they've found about 153 contracts. In reality, there's probably about 450. So it gives you some idea of the amount that's still missing, but it shows that you can really do a lot of good work to collect that information together. It isn't rocket science. As the Open Contracting Partnership, we support an open contracting data standard to join and link that information together. So the EU is bringing in or recommending contract registers. Government's now thinking about how to do that in the member states. So you could use the Open Contracting Data Standard as a way of mapping and unlocking and sharing all the information from different portals. Once you've got that data together properly, then you can do some really important value-added analysis. There's a whole load of things we're going to be hearing about throughout the conference about that. You can look at, for example, red flags. You can actually automate the red flags. The more information you have in advance of things going wrong rather than afterwards, the better the sort of outcomes, the more likely you are to save money. You can also have spending analysis. You can look at supplier diversification. You can also look at your spending with SMEs. That's a real challenge to collate that information together in many member states, as I understand it. Just in terms of encouraging the data and the information, we are going to be, and encouraging the use of the information, we are going to be launching an innovation challenge around open contracting data. So for all the people who want to take the open tenders information, use it to actually look at national kind of implementation and slot that into policy to drive improvements. Hopefully the innovation challenge will encourage you to apply and get a grant there to be able to do that. So that's one of the things we can kind of offer to help kind of carry the DIGIWHIST flag further on. And then lastly, I was going to say, this stuff has been done before, right? So in the room, we have some people from Ukraine, from Transparency International Ukraine. And there, the Open Contracting Data Standard was the heart of the post-Maidan reforms in public procurement there, the ProZorro project. And that was a fully integrated open public contracting project there, where they used open data and radically improved opportunities for companies to bid. They now have about 80% of their spending with SMEs. They probably saved themselves about €1 billion euros and counting from the old sort of Soviet system. And the reduction in perception of corruption by entrepreneurs and people taking part in the system is basically halved and is continuing to come down. So it gives you some idea that open data integrated in systemic change can lead to huge impacts. And lastly, not only on public corruption, just think about it from a business's point of view. If you're in the Netherlands, I think you said there's 29 different forms and portals. These poor small businesses have to kind of consult to look for government contracts. Why not just bring them all together into one and make it simple and available and tie that into your national contract register and then put the red flags analysis on the top? Because obviously businesses will be a key whistleblower if they think the contract terms have been unfavorably manipulated to stop them bidding. So there's so much you can do. The future basically is open. I really want to thank DIGIWHIST for just showing us that we still have a lot of work to do, but it's an exciting path we're going on. Thank you.
Okay, without further ado, I will pass the word to Friedrich Lindberg, who is a freelance journalist from Germany who is into data-driven journalism, so working possibly even with DIGIWHIST data. Go ahead.
Definitely working with DIGIWHIST data. I want to give a little background on how interested investigative reporters are in procurement data. So I'm a member of a community of European data reporters, basically people who meet every now and then to discuss how we can do transnational investigations and look into topics that affect all the European member states commonly, and often enough that relates to data as well. So this community first kind of came together around the topic of farm subsidies and how to open them up and kind of make them accessible to the public for transparency and accountability purposes. That turned into a multi-year adventure of learning how to take apart PDF files and how to fight a lawsuit. And after all of that was done, basically this community said, that was fun, let's do it again. And the question was, what are the next kind of logical targets of looking at what are the data sets that can be used across Europe, basically to create a common public. It's not often that investigative journalists are doing something that could be considered constructive. Mostly what we do is we criticize, but I think it's important that we also kind of think about building a European kind of public in the sense of reporting on topics across the different member states and thinking of common policies across them. So we started working with procurement data, and the first thing we found out is that it's really hard to get procurement data. This was several years before DIGIWHIST even started, and we ended up kind of building our own makeshift solution to getting parts of the TED data. But really, it's a question also of maintenance and upkeep, right? For us as a loose community of journalists, it's almost impossible to kind of operate the data cleaning and data integration effort that's necessary for this data to be accessible to a journalist, to an analyst, to someone who's interested in accountability. And so these kind of projects that kind of might fill the gap between us as an interested audience and, on the other hand, people who are, or the publishing authorities, whether it's TED or the national authorities, that is invaluable. And it's just seeing that table of how much data from different authorities is integrated, that is an effort that I think in terms of kind of data scope stands nothing behind the Panama Papers. This community basically is essentially now being superseded, I guess, by DIGIWHIST, by the efforts of the European Commission also to publish somewhat consolidated TED data, or at least kind of a analyzable version of it, and by other civil society projects like Tenders Exposed. Ada, put up your hand. No, not happening. Okay. So I now work for an organization called the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, which is essentially connecting investigative reporting centers across around 45 different countries with a strong focus on Central and Eastern Europe. And the last investigation that I think had a real relevancy to this town might have been the Azeri laundromat, where we looked at how money laundering was used to influence the decision-making of especially the PACE assembly. our methodology basically is one of kind of following the money, right? So we're not interested very often in economic performance analysis or looking at statistical data, but we're most interested in seeing where does the money flow when money, especially public money, is being used and is supposed to be used in the interest of the public. So whether that is looking at money laundering out of countries with questionable kind of governance, whether it is looking at procurement practices in these countries, and that is kind of a common occurrence. So in the last half a year, we've done an investigation, for example, on how a European company, Bombardier, was involved in cutting in unknown parties into procurement deals in Azerbaijan. We've been working on how companies that are owned by bearer shares, so by a piece of paper, have been used in state procurement in Romania, and we're looking at how companies that are banned from procurement in one country are then kind of reincorporating same directors, different company name, and then kind of re-participating in procurement processes, or are just kind of going to the country next door and starting business there. This seems to be especially common in the medical supplies kind of field. So looking at the data, it's an amazing amount of effort that has been put into it. I want to really re-emphasize as a first kind of point of almost criticism, the thing that you brought up about company identifiers. If we want to follow the money, we need to know who got the money, and who got the money cannot be, like I'm German, and we are very good at not making good data. And when I saw the TED data for the first time, I realized that some genius had actually put office numbers, like I'm sitting in office 224 in the building, in the company name field, and that makes it nearly impossible to then kind of do data mining on that and trace the flow of funds. So we need company identifiers. This has been done before. The European Commission for example, publishes the financial transparency system with VAT identifiers. Even if I work with procurement data from the Russian Federation, I can get tax identifiers in that data, and I can get really good identification of who the companies are that are winning contracts in the Russian Federation. Why can't I get it for European companies, right? And I think it's a question of kind of sitting down, picking the right national identifiers, and then kind of using them coherently. And I think this also comes down to an effort around e-government. The second thing that's proven a real hurdle is I don't think I can find a single journalist in Europe who can explain to you in coherent detail the threshold rules for public procurement data. This is basically, it's meaningful when you're putting out a contract, when you're saying who gets to bid on a contract, but as a transparency and accountability tool, these threshold rules are a killer, and they make it incomprehensible to journalists what to look at and when to look at it. And then there's kind of pie in the sky stuff that are just kind of, since I'm in the European Parliament, I get to make little requests. I would like to know who are the subcontractors of those contracts, who are the other bidders. That's a question that virtually any journalist that I've ever sat down with procurement data has asked, and the only organization I know who's publishing it, I think, is the World Bank, and even they only put it on their website. And finally, more information on who are the parties that have been excluded or banned from further procurement proceedings, because that is also very relevant information to us as investigative reporters. I think this is an invaluable resource, and thank you very much for putting in the 2 or 3 years of effort into making this happen. Thank you.
Thanks, Friedrich, for your comment. And I'll open the floor for questions. So if there are any, go ahead. We're happy to answer.
Do you collect also data for concessions or only public procurement?
Well, depends on the national structure of the portal. Typically, those are strictly divided, so then we are not collecting the concession. Though, for instance, in the Czech Republic, I know there's unified forms. So, for instance, there we have those. But our primary concern was public procurement. Therefore, in most of the countries, we don't have the concessions.
I worked with Romanian data, and I saw that you only had 200,000 available. So essentially they're not necessary tenders, but you do know you can follow the money. So I was wondering, why did you decide to choose only the tenders that you would find in OpenTED over the threshold and not also the smaller money?
That's misinterpretation. Sorry, that must be my mistake, but we did gather those direct awards for Romania. So the statistics I showed earlier, the first ones, were actually gathered from Romanian sources, and then of course we get the remainder of the TED, but from Romania we got the data. Though as you say, it are mostly direct awards, so nothing really that interesting than from what you get from other country, but I guess that's the property of Romanian system and not of the data itself.
The question was more whether you got it for other countries too.
Well, in most of the countries it's below the threshold. These are not direct awards, but yes, we gathered the data from 22 different sources, mostly national sources, plus TED, where there is for countries where there is nothing else.
Just a question.
Please.
Yeah,
if you can.
the presence of a national system for publishing calls for tenders, isn't it somehow duplicating the data that are available at TED for procurements that take place above the threshold? So you would have something published in a national platform and in TED, isn't it so? And otherwise, why would the national, what's the purpose a national platform serves? Is it only for below threshold procurements?
Usually, yes, you are right. In the above threshold sphere, we are having duplicit tenders from both national and from TED, which is, by the way, useful because you can cross-check the information, with which I'm getting to the point that in the national portals you typically get more reliable information than that if it exists. For instance, it's much easier to link the contract awards with contract notices. You have better updates and cancellations. So typically the national source, which is somehow exporting the data to TED and losing some of them in the process, is more reliable. I'm not saying that's the case in all the countries, but yes, sometimes we collect duplicit data. We are well aware of that, and it's not really unhelpful sometimes.
Hi. So you showed that there's a big difference in terms of the data availability and across the European Union. And I was wondering what explains this difference. Is it political will? Is it the lack of legislation? And what could we do about it?
I'll divide the answer to two parts. First is the very availability of the tenders, which in the first place is given by national thresholds for publication. Yeah, in some countries, like Portugal, you have to publish really lots of tenders from really small prices, whereas in countries like Netherlands, you're basically using the EU thresholds of 134,000 euros for the services and nothing below. So there's much less data in volume of tenders for countries like Netherlands. So that's the first part. And second part is the broadness of the data and the quality. If they publish the prices, if they publish the bidders, and I'm not sure whether it's so given by the strictness of regulation or more strictness of its enforcement. Because in some countries, apparently, no one really cares what you publish as information on tenders, whereas in some countries, the publishing authorities are very disciplined, and I wouldn't bet on the idea that they are disciplined from their own free will. Someone pushes them. So it's a matter of legislation and its enforcement, I guess. There was the other question?
Yeah. As you said, the whole idea of gathering this information was through scraping information, right? And with scraping in Georgia, we sometimes encounter problems where we find that some data is either damaged or somehow is misrepresented. And I'm just from a watchdog point of view, the response that we get from the public procurement agency, whenever we do something with our own resources, for instance, by scraping, they always say that, you know, this is not trustworthy information. And what do you think? So I imagine that it would not have been possible to filter out like all of this data, and you initially gathered the data, right? But do you consider somehow filtering it? And for the tender information that is not TED and is national, did you think of a way of making it more comparable in a way, so that you can actually use it in cross-country kind of means?
I'll start from the end. We tried to squeeze all the data into single data template. So in a way, given by the structure, it is comparable in a way. There is same structure for bidder, for buyer, for price, etc. So on a basic level, sure, you can compare across the countries. Back to the question of scraping and reliability. Sure, if someone wants to, he can point at you and saying the data is useless, but basically you need to show, well, there's been, for instance, in DIGIWHIST, there's been a rigorous review process of the data quality, so that ensures at least partially some data quality. And secondly, well, you need to demonstrate that our results are good in the end and prove it. In Czech Republic, after 5 years of fighting with our Ministry of Regional Development, we finally convinced some part of the ministry that our scrape data is actually better than theirs, because we clean it and they don't. So it's ongoing struggle of convincing someone that your data is relevant. And of course, it's easier in a setup where government is close to openly admit that it doesn't have any useful data. So then they are more prone to listen. If the governments feel and is confident they have high quality of data, you need to prove them otherwise before you want to make these kinds of arguments, I guess.
Sorry, if I may add a bit. So the comparability issue is very crucial for us. So when we set out DIGIWHIST almost 3 years ago, we really hope to compare countries based on the national portals, because this is where there's a lot of data, a lot more than TED, and a lot more of the spending is captured. But we basically had to give up because the thresholds are so different, data quality is so different, the regulatory frameworks are different. I cannot even put up a figure saying, oh, this is, you know, this takes three days in, you know, Estonia, takes 20 days in Greece, because the regulations are different. So obviously the actors react to different requirements. So we basically ended up saying, if you want to compare countries and if you're into the business of benchmarking countries, the best we can offer is the TED data, because there the regulatory framework are the same, and then the sample of the contract, the thresholds are the same. And then we have a bunch of countries which are reasonably similar. I mean, we have comparative papers looking at Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary using national data. And it's because the systems are fairly similar in terms of thresholds, in terms of requirements. So for groups of countries, we can go beyond TED, and we are very happy with that. But we actually would have hoped to have a lot more uniformity below threshold, which is, as Ella said at the outset, it's bewildering diversity.
You mentioned that your data is covering about 9 to 12% of the tenders. Do we know from the missing data, the big gap that is referred to, what sectors this involves? Do we know anything about sort of what data is missing in terms of sectoral spending?
That's frankly hard to guess, because these are typically gaps which you judge from something like national accounts, GDP, from public spendings. So you can of course compare cross-country. For instance, in some countries you see there's large portion of IT spendings missing comparing to other countries, since in some countries they consider prolonging long-term contracts as a contract, and in some countries they don't. So you can infer something from cross-country comparison. However, like Mishi said, this is a little bit limited to limited extent. Then you can go typically after exceptions, you know, they are from the directive. Like you can go after spendings leaning towards defense, or legal services will be now hot topic after the directive. But to give a general statement that there is a certain industry where procurement law evasion is more often, that I'm not able to give you from the data.
I'm from Ireland, by the way. I was just wondering, did you have a liaison in every country? Because I think because we have been advertising on the national portal since 2002. We're one of the actual better countries for doing that, and you have to tender everything over 25,000. We do actually have contract registers, but they're FOI accessible. They're not public procurement portal accessible. So my question was that before coming to conclusions, did you have a liaison or anybody where you could do a fact check in any country before you?
We typically had a lawyer familiar with the language doing the mapping. I'd say in half of the countries it was actually someone from the country. In some part of the countries it was not. But what countries you were specifically?
Ireland.
Ireland.
Because you have there's no ethics legislation down for Ireland, and we've had ethics legislation since 2002. And whistleblower legislation for the past 7 years.
Frankly, I'm not familiar with the legal mapping output, but we identified the portal where quite a decent portion of the data is published, so we extracted the data.
So did you assume that the data is all either in or around the portal? So for example, if you have ethics legislation, you'd have ethics legislation for a broad measure of things, not just procurement. So if procurement wasn't in the title of that legislation, did you assume it wasn't there?
You'd have to ask the lawyers who did the legal mapping. Frankly, I'm not competent to answer this kind of question. But in general, there was a lawyer inspecting the local legislation, and typically it was someone in Ireland. I'm pretty confident it was someone familiar with the situation, and he gave us information. Okay, this is the data worth scraping. That's all I can give you. Well, we can revisit this definitely afterwards, and we can ask the colleagues how was it specifically with Ireland. I don't know more. Sorry.
Okay.
Thank you very much for this comment, and we're definitely open for improving our work. And I think what has to be kept in mind is that we really took the point of view of the average citizen, right? If you're an average citizen, you want to know about contracts, which portal would you go to? What's your national procurement portal, right? We found this portal, we got all the data which is there. And all these numbers which Jiri presented, I'm pretty sure there's a lot more contracts government have access to, right? But this is an open data portal. So if you're a government, you want to inform your citizens, this is what you actually do. This is what actually can be found, the Irish Central Procurement Portal. We admit that we don't do subnational, right? There might be a lot of publication in federal countries on the regional level or local level in the UK. But really is what is out there right now, what is collectible, what you can see as a citizen. I think it's a valid point of view. It's not a generic assessment of the quality of the Irish data in general, right? It's really about public procurement central registers, which companies monitor and which citizens would want to monitor if they're interested in government accountability.
Okay, last question.
Just one question. We also publish since 2013 spending and tendering data every year, and it's all on the procurement.ie website, which is central.
We'd be happy to scrape it. Last question. Go ahead.
Although this work is mostly based on scraping, have you been able to establish positive relationships with authorities in charge of national portals who publish those data as an institutional mandate?
In some countries, yes. In some countries, the effort seemed quite time-consuming and non-productive. So in general, we tried to inform them we want to scrape the data in such way. And in some countries, we even asked for the help and got some. But in general, mostly we ended up scraping the website because we were referred to some information we already knew. Yeah, but generally speaking, yes, we got some feedback, but I expect now when the results will get public, we are going to get much more of it. So thank you all for the questions. We'll all be around here for a while, so feel free to ask further on, but the time is finished, and I have to pass the word to Mihaly Fazekas, who will continue with another panel. Thank you very much.
That's good. Great. So thank you very much for the members of the first session. Then we are moving on to the second session, which is looking at how you can use this data to come up with reasonable indicators which deliver interesting insights. So I'm going to give you the introductory presentation, very brief. And then we have two commentators. One is Frank Michlik from OLAF. Other one is Anna Gomes for MEP, who should be arriving soon. I don't see her around the table. Yes, exactly. We have to change the name tags and give over the seat to the new speakers. Okay. So let me start by saying that one of the central goals of DIGIWHIST was not just looking at data, but really try to make sense of it, because this is really enormous amount of information. We have contracts for nuclear power plants to school meals to fixing local roads and bridges. So really, it's no straightforward business to make sense of this. And I'm really going to focus on one aspect, which is probably the most likely candidate for hitting newspaper headlines, which is about our corruption risk indicators and our objective corruption risk indices. The data we use, indicators we develop, and the reasons why we think they are valid and reliable. And then I will show a very few insights which some of you might have seen already, really just to see the breadth of things you can get with this kind of data. And then this will hopefully show the way to the third panel, which looks at tools and portals making use of such data. So about measuring corruption risks, and the overall DIGIWHIST measurement framework. We have set out to do something very comprehensive, starting from legislation, Europam, really looking at country-level laws, detailed mapping which builds on the World Bank's public accountability mechanism, PAM work, and then going deep into the actual spending data, public procurement data, linked to company information and public budgets where it was possible. We have three major groups of indicators: transparency, administrative capacity, and corruption integrity. And I'm going to focus on the last one, the corruption integrity part. So our definition of corruption is something which is relatively easy to measure and easily resonates both with policymakers and the everyday understandings of corruption in public procurement. So we talk about corruption in public procurement when there is an intent to steer the contract to favored bidder without detection. Now, how is it possible to steer a contract to favored connected bidder in public procurement when we have all sorts of openness and transparency rules? Now, it requires avoiding competition, somehow limiting the openness of competition, fairness of competition. And it also requires this limitation, this constraint on open competition to be used purposefully for favoring a certain bidder, right? So just by a school not managing to tender competitively because it's good in teaching but not good in running complex tenders, that's not competition, right? That's maybe incompetence, lack of capacity. However, when this limited competition is used for getting the contract to the right person, to the right company, then we are talking about public procurement corruption. Now, this definition might be quite different from legal definitions, criminal law concepts, or OLAF's fraud definition, right? It overlaps, but what we are doing is somewhat broader. Now, how this definition translates into the field of public procurement and transactional data or tendering data we are working with. First, there is a contract at the heart of all of this, right? Any corrupt group would want the contract to be steered to the right companies, to the right individuals, in a way that they can extract rents from it. They can overprice it, or they can compromise on quality so that there is money to run with or transfer it to Panama or whichever country you like. Now we have to have two official actors a contracting body and supplier. And because we are talking about corruption, it's not just a formal relationship. There is an inherent informal aspect to it, which we call a particularistic tie or a personal tie, right? So if you have a written contract enforceable by courts, but you have a second deal informal based on connections, then you have to monitor, you have to enforce these informal deals somehow. That's where family relationship, long-term friendship is very important, because they create a sort of trust which allows you to govern informally these complex legal relationships. And what's interesting about all this is that we can come up with indicators for each of these four main components. We can look at indicators of tendering risks, so the biases in the tendering process. We can look at the suppliers themselves, whether there are risks in how the companies are set up. We can look at contracting bodies, whether they are overly politicized or seemingly under political control or pressure. And finally, we can look at political personal connections, as I said, which monitor and govern these relationships. So 4 groups of indicators of corruption risk we have developed. And what's cool about all this is that we have a lot of measurement error, a lot of missing data. People are sometimes actually very good in hiding information, but we can use the 4 groups to triangulate, right? Maybe you see some red flags in the tendering process. Can you be certain that this is really high risk, right? Maybe not, maybe yes. But if you link that to supplier information or link that to political connection between the supplier and the contracting body, then you can triangulate your findings. You can strengthen your trust in your data, that you're actually measuring corruption risk rather than incompetence or just error in the data. I'm going to quickly talk you through 2 examples which we have advertised quite widely. One is a typical tendering risk indicator, single bidding on competitive markets. Other one is supplier risk indicator, which is based on the age of the supplier, in particular very young suppliers, very young companies. So let's start with single bidding. So how does it work? What's the scheme we are trying to measure when we look at single bidding? There are different versions, but one widely quoted and in the media widely described technique is very simple. You have a competitive tender, you have to openly advertise it, but your corrupt friends are not particularly good. They're not particularly productive, right? So you somehow have to make sure that the tendering is not fair, the process itself is biased. And how you do it is that you announce the tender very late, you allow very, very short time for bidding companies, potentially interested bidding companies, to officially compile their tenders. In addition, what you do, you informally tell your friends, hey, here is the tendering documentation, the tender specs. It's going to be advertised in a couple of weeks. Start preparing your bids. And then everyone else on the market who doesn't have this kind of access, this kind of connections, will not have enough time. Now, this is the scheme which results in single bidding, which results in overpriced contracts, and which we call high corruption risk situations. How do we identify that in 17 million contracts, right? This is our challenge. We understand the theory, the ideal case, but how do we identify that in the data? So one thing you do, you look at the advertisement periods, or the periods, number of days available for companies to bid. So that's between advertising a call for tender and a submission deadline, right? This is a particular example from Portugal, and you can see that there are 2 spikes around 40 and 50 days. So these are the legally mandated minimums under certain different conditions. But you can also see that on the left-hand side, there is a tight deadline part of the distribution. So that is where we have 7 days, 10 days, 20 days, quite few days for putting together bids, right? So this is directly what we are looking for. This is what comes from the story. Now, the question is, what really is tight? How is it 20 days? Is it 30? So how do we identify that? And this is where we use statistical modeling to link these short advertisement periods, these tight deadlines, to the likelihood of single bidding, right? Because the idea was that there is a tight deadline, as a result, there is single bidding. So with statistical tools, we basically predict single bidding as a function of the number of days. And then in this Portuguese case, all these tenders with less than 30 days for the advertisement period, they have on average 14% higher likelihood of single bidding. So this is exactly what we would predict from a corrupt schema, we know from qualitative evidence, and this is what we can identify in the data. Single bidding and tight deadlines. Now, our qualitative work has been around collecting many of these cases, these ideal scenarios of high corruption risk situations. We had interviews in Sweden, Italy, Germany, the UK, many Eastern European countries. So we did a thorough job in identifying these cases. And then we looked for the data and tried to statistically capture these situations. Now, if you are not convinced by single bidding being a corruption risk indicator from this kind of micro evidence, contract level evidence, one thing you can do is to look at, hey, we expect rich countries to be less corrupt. I mean, at least I think most of you would agree. And this is exactly what you see. You have a corruption risk score which pulls together single bidding and these tight deadlines on the regional level in Europe and GDP per capita, right? You can also look at single bidding as a single score. That would be the vertical axis. And you would have our perceptions as gathered by the World Governance Institute Control of Corruption score. So countries on the bottom right, they would be perceived to have a high control of corruption, so low corruption risk, and also small share of single bidding. And countries on the left-hand side, you would have high single bidding share, and perception saying, well, these countries are not good in controlling corruption. Okay, so we roughly get it right. There is micro evidence, then there is macro evidence for validity of these indicators. Now, we're talking about the budget, the EU's budget, right? And then that's Jávor Benedek was very right pointing out how much money at stake there is. And then we have plenty of evidence for price increases due to corruption risk. This is one particular one which is very straightforward, which is comparing the average savings offered on tenders. So that's the difference between the reference price and the final contract value. And look at these savings by the number of bidders. Quite unsurprisingly, as the number of bidders increases, so competition becomes more intense, then the average savings increases. So moving from a single bidder contract to a double, so like 2 bidders contract, we decrease prices by 6%. So from 10% discount to 16% discount. So this matters a lot, given the high amounts of public money going into these public procurement contracts. Now, moving on to the second example, which is company age and a supplier risk index. So if you take standard economic theory, that would be a very straightforward prediction. Young companies with little capital, with little skills, kind of short company CVs, so few contracts on their books, they would win relatively little in public procurement. So that would be the age of the company, and that would be the amount of money winning. So right here, young companies would win little, right? Because they don't have the right skills, the right investment. As the company ages, becomes bigger, makes investments to skills and machinery and things like that, the success will increase, and then companies will win more. And then this flattens out after time. We have talking about a mature company. So this is what economic theory would tell you. We can produce these actual empirical figures for all European countries by now. One of my favorite is Hungary. I'm Hungarian. I have to say that this is an empirical distribution coming from 2010, which was an election year in Hungary. It's exactly the same, the years of age of the company, and then the amount of money won on average by company. Each bar would represent a couple of hundred companies falling into that category. Now, there are two notable things here. The first one is what we expected, that very young companies in a year of government change are surprisingly successful, right? It really looks like they have been set up by politicians' friends for getting contracts, right? Otherwise, how do you explain companies of zeros, meaning a couple of months old, or even 12, 13 months, winning that much, outlier much, right? So that was the first shock, but it's kind of predicted from political science. Now, there is another spike at 13. So companies 13-year-old in 2010 winning a lot, right? What is that? Is there a reasonable expectation for this? And we thought long and hard, and actually the answer is again very political. So the first time the Fidesz government came into power was 13 years before 2010. So in this bar, these companies were the zeros and the ones 13 years before, so when the same government came into power. Again, very simple risk indicators. We are by no means suggesting these are all corrupt people, right? We are suggesting these patterns are consistent with a corruption explanation, and we have no better story to explain these. Now, not to get stuck only on Hungary, because both Benedek and me, I'm Hungarian, we are Hungarians. Let's look at a comparative work, Hungary and Sweden. Another thing we would expect from these young companies, if they are in fact vehicles of corruption, is that they are overly profitable, right? They make a lot of money, a lot more than what we would expect from them. And this is surprisingly true both for Hungary and Sweden. So companies of 1 year or younger have 9.5% of profit rate on average. Companies of older than 1 year, they have something like 5.9% in Sweden, right? They're also likely to be a lot more single bidding contracts. Of course, single bidding is rare in Sweden, but still it jumps from 4.7% to 7.1%. Even in Hungary, the 28% manages to go up to almost 31%. So we have the full picture, right? These companies suspiciously young, they shouldn't win that much, they do. Especially when the government changes, they are more profitable than their peers, and then they're a lot more likely to have no competition. Again, it's 5 bits of evidence, no proof, but I would definitely say that these are together fairly strong indicators of corruption risk. Some closing remarks about what you can do with these indicators if I manage to convince that they actually much more than just error or incompetence, but really corruption risk. You can look at high-resolution insights, right? We used to look at corruption on the country level, right? Or corruption in the judiciary, very, very broad institutions, very broad brush judgments, right? We can dig down to municipalities. We can dig down to companies, individual actors. We can look at complex analytics. We can develop network analysis of high-risk organizations. You can really start building up for individual transactions, individual organizations into systems of corruption or integrity, more complex way. And then finally, you can have automatic evaluation of spending programs such as EU funds and changes in control rules, things similar like that. So one thing we have looked at Sweden, and Sweden is a great country because we all agree that this is a high integrity country, kind of corruption is sorted there, right? So looking at municipalities in Sweden, then it's an interesting testing ground for our work. If we say absolutely no corruption in Sweden, there's no way for the DIGIWHIST to add value here. However, we found quite surprising things here. We did something very straightforward, predicted by checking what political science theory would predict. Basically, municipalities without meaningful competition, political competition for the top posts, so the government, local government, they are more likely to be high corruption risk municipalities. And this is because if you are a politician and you have not challenged, and we looked at for decades, so since the 70s, not seriously challenged, there was no turnover, no change in the local government since the 70s, then, these systems start to build up. And we expect this logic to happen, to take place also in Sweden. And this is exactly what we find. So municipalities which have been ruled by the very same party over 30 years, they have something like 50% single bidding share, as opposed to municipalities where there was at least one turnover of the local government, which was somewhat below 12%. Interestingly, if you decompose this one-party rule and then you look at those which recently changed, single bidding drops. Surprisingly, in Sweden, political turnover actually directly influences public procurement outcomes. You have similar results from England, again looking at a high integrity country where we think it's sorted, corruption is sorted out. And we looked at price savings, comparing something we call one-party dominated councils, again for 20 years, the same party running the council, having the majority in the councils versus the rest of the English local councils. And savings drastically change between these two groups. Savings amount to 6.2% on average in local councils where there was a political turnover, as opposed to 2.2% only in municipalities where there was no political turnover on the local level. And this is my last slide to show you the kind of complexities which can be revealed by this kind of analysis and indicators. What we depicted here is Hungary between 2011 and 12, and we selected only those buyers and suppliers which were above average corruption risk in their tendering activities, such as single bidding, tight deadlines, seemingly tailored product description and criteria, right? And the question was very straightforward. Is corruption an isolated phenomenon, a random process happening here and there as opposed to a generic, systemic state capture situation? And what we did here, we only looked at these high-risk organizations and checked if they were connected. And then to our horror, to our shock, we found that all of these, or except for these very minor ones on the edges, all of these were tightly connected. And this is what we call a systematic corrupt situation. There are other countries where we see the very similar patterns, where corruption is not the exception to the rule, but actually it is the rule. Every single organization which is high corruption is they contract with each other, and this encompasses pretty much the whole public sector, right? So this is what big data can reveal and tell you about countries, and you can track these networks over time and also going back in time. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the commentaries. I think Ana Gomes, MEP, is our next speaker. Thank you very much for accepting the invite in spite of the parallel running Libe committee meeting, and we are very much looking forward to your comments.
Thank you. Thank you for the initiative, for inviting me to come here to speak to you about indeed how big data can be a very important tool in our fight against corruption, uncovering indeed patterns of systemic corruption. Well, we know that. We know that because there wouldn't have been LuxLeaks or Panama Papers leaks, or now Paradise Papers leaks, without indeed big data being a tool to indeed identify the correlations in all the web of obscurity that is purportedly cultivated to indeed prevent transparency and to allow the corrupt proceeds to be hidden. But I'm very happy that indeed now many organizations understand that indeed this tool must be used in a much more efficient way. And I must tell you, I, as a member of the parliament who has tried to uncover corruption in my own country and in other countries of the EU, and when I see a case and I have elements, I normally forward them to the relevant authorities who could act, OLAF, the Commission, at the national level, the justice institutions. I've often found myself unable to indeed dig more. Some of these investigations are the product of excellent work done by journalists or by some civil society organizations, but there's a lot of work that I do myself, you know, based on Google. And I often, on Google, and of course trying to make connections with the other elements that I have that some sources give to me. And there's been one or two cases where I would really need to have some expert in big data to indeed try to identify the correlations, try to go behind what I can see. And I couldn't find any. There are companies who can do that for money, yeah. But, you know, I'm not supposed to be spending money in that kind of thing. And so I really appreciate that now the community of organizations fighting corruption really understands that this tool, which is a tool with that offers many possibilities, but also many dangers, I mean, I myself was the author of a report here in this parliament on big data. And doing the research on big data, I could indeed sense the tremendous opportunities, but as well the tremendous dangers of what is going on already with the use of big data by big companies in a totally unregulated, unethical way. But then, okay, let's use the tool for good purpose, and namely to indeed find through massive amounts of data in the financial system and the banking system, and actually identify the corrupt and identify what I think is indeed a pattern of state capture in most of our states. It's not just something, and I think that's the main conclusion that we can take from the work we have done now with the tax committees and with the Panama Papers Committee, and hopefully soon with the Paradise Papers Committee, because as you know, in the Parliament we are trying to establish an inquiry committee to continue to dig now on the basis of Paradise Papers. And for that, indeed, having your support and the support of experts who could help us treat data is very important. Of course, it will never, it will probably give us more of an accurate picture of the level of state capture. And indeed, as I was telling you, through these reports, we come to the conclusion that we have indeed a big problem of state capture in many of European Union member states. And that level, it's not something that is only happening in kleptocracies in other latitudes. It's happening inside the European Union with differences, with cases where there are reaction by the authorities, but as well with many cases where there is no reaction. And that's why I was telling you that indeed the more fine-tuned we can present the picture of this level of state capture, the better. But it will eventually help us indeed make those who could act indeed act, because that's the kind of problem that I face in many of my cases where I go and I expose them, be it to the European authorities or to the national authorities, is that they just do nothing, even when the cases are very clear. And the kind of picture that now has been emerging more and more is actually where there are contradictions, where, for instance, at the European level, I get the authorities to indeed acknowledge, agree that there is a serious case for action on corruption, and then the national authorities just don't care. I have had, for instance, a case that involved the company in my own country, Portugal, Tecnoforma, which used European funds supposedly to train people to man aerodromes that never existed, which was manned, that company, by our former Prime Minister, Mr. Passos Coelho. The Commission found that indeed my complaint was very relevant and that the state had to pay back money that was disbursed under these funds. And the Portuguese public prosecutor closed the case. There's now another interesting case. Just last week I heard news from the Commission on two military ships that the Portuguese state had placed with a national shipyard back in 2004. These ships were for the Portuguese Navy. The Portuguese state had a Portuguese national shipyard. It would make sense that it would build that. The previous government, under the Troika austerity program, decided to privatize the shipyards. And in order to privatize the shipyards, they canceled the contracts. But after the shipyards were privatized, the same government gave two of the ships to be made by direct contract by the new privatized company, who never had, by the way, any experience of building ships. And without a public tender, and in a in a totally in a case really clearly smacking of corruption. Well, now I'm pleased to say that the Commission informed me last week that they found that the public procurement in defense contracts norms had been violated. But in the meantime, I was told by our prosecutors that the case was probably going to be closed in Portugal because our audit court had given an okay to the contracts, although they were obviously violating any rules of transparency and of course even European laws. So this is happening more and more. I can tell you I've been now focusing more on a particular country of the EU. Malta is a small country, very small, as we know. Small is being used as an excuse, so you shouldn't care, you shouldn't listen. It's small. It's small. It's smallness that justifies that Luxembourg has been tax haven, that Malta transformed into a tax haven. But it's much more than tax haven. It's the corruption, all sorts of corruption deals that go on. And as we know, in the case of Malta, it took the life of a whistleblower, a major journalist and blogger, exposing corruption. And what we hear, I mean, what we are still digging on that. As you know, the Parliament even dispatched a mission to Malta, which I headed, on the rule of law, because it actually found out that the situation was not just a mere situation in terms of problems in taxation, of problems of money laundering, of dysfunctionality of justice, that the rule of law could as well be at stake. That's why the mission was called on the rule of law. But of course, most of the things, apart from the murder, the assassination of Daphne Caruana Galizia, we've been focusing are indeed, and they are linked, of course, it's corruption, major corruption. Corruption to this point. Nobody notices that, but former Maltese commissioner who was forced to resign from the commission, Mr. John Daly, because he elicited bribes for the tobacco, from the tobacco industry, and was, by the way, denounced by some Swedish company to whom he had illicit bribes, or someone by him. He was forced to resign in the Barroso Commission, and he went back to Malta, his country, with a very, very serious OLAF report on his deeds, and the Maltese FIU, Financial Investigative Unit, uncovered also and confirmed many of the things that OLAF and went further. So you would have expected this person to be at least charged, if not put in jail. Well, he was made advisor to the Prime Minister. And till this day, nothing happened to him. His daughters are now charged for having being involved in a Ponzi scheme, and there are suggestions that actually he might have a finger in it. But this is to tell you how serious the situation is. And I haven't seen the Commission worried about that. The Commission shelved the anti-corruption report. The first and only one came out in 2014. As you know, the second one was supposed to come in 2016. Me and a few others of my colleagues have pestered the Commission, namely Vice President Timmermans, with questions about when is this report due. And then last we were told there won't be the report, because now we're going to do it in the European semester. Nobody does anything in the European semester about inquiries about corruption. First and foremost, because those of us colleagues who know a bit about the ways the corrupt proceed are not sitting in the committee that is normally dealing with the European semester. And that's why nobody cared that Mr. Daly was never prosecuted and is probably continuing with his criminal activity in his own country, Malta. Just to give you a latest one, I mean, Barroso was the president of the Commission when when Mr. Dali, that forced Mr. Dali to resign, rightly. But Barroso himself was all the time with questions unanswered about a very serious deal he had been involved regarding the purchase of German submarines to my own country, which is his country, Portugal. Now, interesting, Barroso now is working with Goldman Sachs. Barroso is now lobbying, if you read the Portuguese newspapers, where there's a very interesting case of involving corruption now being tried, because there was a Portuguese public magistrate, a Portuguese prosecutor, who was jailed for being accused of being involved in closing a case on anti-money laundering involving the vice president of Angola, Mr. Manuel Vicente. This prosecutor is now being tried. It's a case, a very serious case, because of course it involves the corruption of a Portuguese prosecutor. It's a very serious case because of course Angola, even with a new president, doesn't want the case to be tried, involving his vice president, invoking immunity, amnesty laws and so on. Nothing really that applies. But so interesting, Mr. Barroso is one of the people of what is called the economic lobby, lobbying against the trial, because it could bring a lot of hurt to the Angolan-Portuguese relations. I don't think so. I think that that case can be absolutely determinant to indeed not just serve the fight against corruption in my own country, and therefore within the European Union, but actually in a country like Angola, and expose exactly the perverse links that have been tolerated by national and European authorities. We're talking about a vice president who is also a major shareholder of several banks in the European Union, in my country, Portugal. That cannot be neglected by the national authorities, by the European Commission, by the European Banking Authority, by the ECB. This is a very clear sign that indeed capture of the state is very much there. And that's where, again, I'll finish saying, yes, we will welcome every tool that will help us expose the corrupt, and big data are indeed a very important and relevant tool. So all my support to and my request for keeping in touch for those of us who here in the Parliament need indeed the support of experts in big data or in cyber deciphering that can really help us be even more effective in our job. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your lively commentary and very colorful stories and examples. It was illuminating. Now I hand over the word to Frank Michlik from OLAF, who is the head of unit of policy on fraud prevention in particular. And then I think he has a long-standing interest in measurement of fraud and indicators and red flags. I will put on your PowerPoint in a minute.
Thank you very much, Mihaly. I'm head of unit fraud prevention, reporting and analysis, as Mihaly said, in the policy directorate. So our unit doesn't deal with investigations, but we try to help to support fraud prevention. And perhaps before I start, or in the beginning of my presentation, let me briefly explain you OLAF's mandate. So our mission is to detect, investigate, the first slide, please, to detect, investigate, and fight fraud affecting the financial interest of the EU. So that means we conduct independent investigations into fraud, corruption, and irregularities affecting the financial interest of the EU. And the Dali case, for example, was the result of one of these investigations. And we also investigate serious misconduct of EU staff of non-financial nature, and we develop policies to counter fraud against the financial interest of the EU, and that is where my unit comes into play. So OLAF's actions are important to contribute that the taxpayers' monies reach the project, so that they can stimulate the creation of jobs and growth in Europe. And we come to the next slide. So OLAF experience concerning public procurement, as this is the specific topic, subject of DIGIWHIST's work, shows that public procurement is still a very attractive marketplace for perpetrators of fraud. And many fraud cases are transnational, which makes it even more difficult. So the contracting authority, for example, is from one member state, and the bidders are from several other member states, who then subcontract different other countries. Often there is an unlawful splitting of contracts, also related to conflict of interest, and regularly fraud at procurement level also leads to fraud at the implementation level. So falsified invoices, product substitution, etc. So this means, we come to the next slide, that anti-fraud safeguards in public procurement should be a priority for everybody in the member states and at EU level. This means that people dealing with procurement should become familiar with the possible types of fraud, with red flags. Awareness has to be raised concerning the new public procurement integrity rules among all public procurement actors, also including the judiciary. And a culture of integrity has to be promoted. I mean, the rules are there. We have the new public procurement directives and other rules which have been implemented in most member states, but they also have to be applied. And this means really we have to raise awareness. People have to become aware, have to see if there are signals, if there are the so-called red flags. And the whole public procurement governance has to be improved to ensure a better collection and analysis of the data. And that's why we are very happy with the work DIGIWHIST is doing with the data. We will also have a lunchtime debate, a presentation in OLAF by Mihaly the day after tomorrow. So we are very happy about the work DIGIWHIST is doing. Let me, on my last slides, go to the outlook and perhaps give a bit of hope also to the issues raised by Mrs. Gomes. There are two main initiatives which OLAF supported recently. One is the so-called PIF directive. So this gives definitions of fraud, corruption, and which also means, for example, that by law now VAT fraud is included in the EU activities. And perhaps even more important, the establishment of the European Public Prosecutor's Office, which means once the European Public Prosecutor is established, and which will be the case in a couple of years, at least if European money is involved, the prosecutors in the member states will receive their instructions from the European Public Prosecutor set up at European level. So that means we will have a collegial system where each member state sends a European Public Prosecutor, but then the European Public Prosecutor's Office will have antenna in the member states. So that means public prosecutors with a double head. So that means in the case of EU money being involved, the public prosecutor from Brussels or Luxembourg or The Hague, wherever it will be established, can order the public prosecutor to bring that to court. I mean, then, of course, and that is good, the courts are independent and need to remain independent in the member states, but at least at the level of prosecution, when European money is involved, a case like you mentioned would not happen anymore. So I think it is still a difficult problem, but there is light at the end of the tunnel, and we are happy for all the support we receive from the European Parliament, from civil society. So I think it is a common goal to fight fraud and corruption in public procurement, but also in other areas. But here it is especially important, and we are very happy for all the help we receive there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Frank, for your comments. So now we have 15 minutes for open floor question and answers, and then coffee break. So the floor is yours.
sorry, forgive me, leaning across. Just a question to the DIGIWHIST team. So obviously you're looking at the possibility of red flags. Did you see routine use of red flags already across EU public procurements, institutions, both member states and the Commission?
It's a difficult question. Routine use, probably not. We have featured in a number of reports, which fed into policy work in the European Parliament, various European Commission DGs. We have one success case when the European Investment Bank is using our risk indicators for targeting their preventive work, so the fraud and audit team looking at, like they have so-called ex-ante transparency reviews. That's where we are supporting, but we are hoping for contributing to more to this kind of regular auditing work. But I think we have to be careful, right? Because there is the data issue, and there is the fact that we are looking at risk. So usually what we advise is just because a single tender has a high risk score, it's probably, it can go either way, right? But if you have an organization which is systematically high risk, in spite of its competitors on the market, for example, and you have indication of political connection, something else, then this is a very strong indication. Still risk, but a lot stronger. What we hope to expand, and then I think Ella mentioned that at the outset, is that looking at systems of corruption, weaknesses in the institutional setup is where our kind of big data work can help. I know in the UK, our work on local level corruption risk and political competition had big waves. It was quoted in the House of Lords, and then the Cabinet Office is indeed using that for their corruption, anti-corruption work on the local level. So we hope to have more of this. But regular work, I mean, that's probably the next few years, we hope. Yes, this is a very important point of our methodology. So we start from known cases, but known cases meaning a broad class of cases. Some of it is actual concluded judicial cases. A lot of it is reported by the media, so cases which smell, but we are not 100% sure, right? And then in addition, the media review of reported cases by the media. It might overlap, there might be a legal proceeding next to it, maybe it's just in the media reported. And we had our own qualitative work, which basically involved interviewing participants in public procurement, kind of them giving us their stories they participated in, seen for the competitors, right? So that was where we collected case evidence. And the second big group of starting point of qualitative knowledge was from policy reports, which actually have quite numerous by now. Transparency International has a list of red flags. The World Bank has a long list of red flags. OLAF is working on this. So indeed, we could draw on a broad literature of different red flags, building on experts as well as cases.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about the relationship between the value added by DIGIWHIST project in terms of collecting this open data and putting it together and cleaning it, compared to your investigative analysis in the second part. If you would have ID for the supplier, how much the quality of your risk indicator would improve? How you judge it based on experience you have from the DIGIWHIST project?
Yes, so the two parts work together, right? I mean, I cannot do any analytics without data, and just the mere publishing of data probably would limit the users quite drastically. Now, we feed on good quality data. That's what we work with, right? If we don't have the IDs, then it's very hard to build organizational profiles, right? As I mentioned, we start trusting our indicators when we see systematic behavior of an organization. So that's why what Jiri mentioned, that we believe our data is better than what's the official data, because we assigned these IDs, right? We did the hard work of assigning VAT or company registry IDs to suppliers. It has some error, we can improve that, all that. But basically, we recognize this problem that most EU governments don't publish structured IDs, unique IDs. We need them for our red flagging work. So one of our hard tasks was to identify, to assign these IDs. And now we can build patterns, can build up organizational profiles, and can say things like, oh, this company on this market usually has no competitors. Other companies on that market usually compete against 2, 3 others. What's happening with that company, right? And then we can dig further. We have the ownership data linked to it now. We have the registration data. Is there a company registered in a tax haven in the ownership structure of that particular company? So we can start build up a profile. But this crucially depends on the IDs, and we would very much prefer not doing it ourselves, but having it on the source officially announced company IDs.
If I may, in terms of the countries you looked at, has anyone doing consistently buyer and supplier ID in the EU member states?
Yes, we have. Jiri had a map with the actual countries publishing. I cannot recall which one were kind of best practice. Maybe Jiri can help me out.
There were nowhere it was 100%, but Czech Republic, Slovakia, Croatia might be cases where you can get at least decent proportion of the IDs published. Otherwise, it's somewhere between 20 to 80% for most of the countries where you get those identifiers.
Now, of course, IDs have errors, right, Elisa? So that's the other thing which we found, like, hey, this is the company name, and this is the company ID announcement, but the company court register doesn't have these two things at the same organization, right? So again, just because there's a number, where there should be a number complying with that some sort of standard, like 8 letters, doesn't mean that this is the correct thing. So that is our ultimate worry, that what's in the public announcement doesn't reflect the reality of the actual signed contract, the actual payments. That's why the few countries which actually link transactions to public announcements, such as Slovakia, is our only hope. Because if you do transactions on paper usual way, and you have public announcements completely unrelated, then how do we assure that the transactions are the same as what you tell the public, right? The only way to know for sure is that what the Slovakians have done, right? You cannot pay without publishing the contract, and without that contract actually having the same information as what you have in your official announcements, right? So you have the full transaction to announcement scale linked together, and there we can check, there we can trust that data.
This is not just for the DIGIWHIST, but also for the policymakers on this panel. Are you confident that we have the right legal conditions, that this stuff is actually legal? I mean, it does us absolutely no good if we put up an amazing website this month, and then in May we get the Data Protection Directive, and anyone who doesn't want to be on DIGIWHIST doesn't have to be on DIGIWHIST.
Well, there are commercial registers that are supposed to be public in most member states, I think. And we have tried, for instance, and we now, in the terms of the first anti-money laundering, member states are, for instance, supposed as well to have a register of ultimate beneficial owners. These kind of data to identify the companies involved should be there. The problem is that often they are confusing on purpose. For instance, companies register in the little tax haven that my own country has, Madeira. Every 3 months, they change the directors. They publish it in the local official journal. They publish they change the directors, or they change the address. And of course, it's to obfuscate and to make it more difficult to trace who's involved in what. But that's exactly one reason why we have to be smarter and to make the links. And that's why the technology can be extremely useful to make correlations that otherwise we would not be able to make.
So you pointed at a painful point of this project. It's a hard work in front of us. We are pretty confident that we can republish the data as is, right? But as I said, our core added value is to make sense of this data, and that is the hard part. So if we publish an indicator on a company or a public sector body saying it's a low capacity or high integrity, you know, then this is an open question. We hope and we think that we are allowed, because we're only using public data, and this is basically based on formulas and mathematical and statistical calculations. No opinion is added, but still we are suggesting a particular interpretation, and that's the fine line of being able to keep this running, not just the core data, but actually the indicators and all the benchmarking. I mean, it's one of our cool tools. People like you benchmark organizations against each other, right? That's how you derive insights. That's how you learn. But that involves some sort of assessment, and that's hard. One last question. Okay, thank you very much.
Could I just add something? I mean, yeah, of course, data protection is what is often used by those who want to prevent exposure. Governments or other institutions. But I think we should not be deterred by that. I mean, we have plenty of public data on which to operate. And even when we select the data, of course, which to publish, we will not, of course, be publishing some kind of data that could be more questionable in terms of, it's for instance, the address of the company, it's the tax identification of the beneficial owners, or some things like that. That should not be under data protection. I think this is indeed it's a major obstruction that I found in my own attempts to investigate certain cases, often being confronted with authorities saying data protection. For instance, everything that involves, for instance, the programs such as golden visas and or individual investors programs, but we should be prepared to fight that fight, to pick that fight, and to not accept to be silent and idle in face of those who waive data protection. Often, data protection is not at all a good argument.
Great, thank you very much. You have been an amazing audience so far. 30 minutes coffee break. See you at 3:30.